Picture this. Chicago, 1910. A public library. Two men are hunched over a world atlas, moving between maps and indexes, looking for a word neither of them can find. They have just come from a prayer meeting where a prophetic word was spoken over them, a single geographical name, and they do not recognize it. They have searched the reference section, they have checked geography books. Now, one of them finds it. One finger traces down through South America, past Colombia, past Venezuela, down into the broad green delta of the Amazon basin. He stops. He has found it. It is a state in the far north of Brazil, on the Atlantic coast of the Amazon Delta, equatorial, Portuguese-speaking, a world utterly unlike Sweden or Chicago, or anything either man has known. Its capital is Belém do Pará, a port city where the great river meets the sea. They have no contacts there. They do not speak a word of Portuguese. They have no mission society, no salary, no supporting church. Between them they have $90, and accounts tell of how they gave those $90 away, and how the exact sum was returned through a stranger they had never met. The prophecy that sent them to the library had given them a destination, and through the long search for a ship, it was confirmed. One departure, one small line, one date. Within weeks, they are on a ship. The two men bent over that atlas, who stepped ashore in Belém on November 19th, 1910, with almost nothing, and planted what became the largest Pentecostal movement in Brazil, were Daniel Berg and Adolf Gunnar Vingren. And this story will not just show you what they built, it will show you what it cost them. The hidden price behind the fire that burns across a continent, and what it will cost you. Comment below with, "Lord, one word from you is enough." If you are ready to give your last dollar, stoke a furnace for the gospel, and release what you built. Stay to the end, where we reveal the hidden disciplines that kept Berg and Vingren burning for 50 years, which will enable you to run with endurance the race set before you. Gunnar Vingren was born on August 8, 1879, in Östergötland, Sweden. His father was a gardener, steady, practical, quiet work, who was also the Baptist Sunday school leader at the local church. At age 9, Gunnar felt God's call on his life. He began gathering other children to pray. The calling was not vague. The question was never whether, only what. Daniel Berg was born Daniel Högberg on April 19, 1884, in Vargön, Sweden. His parents were Baptist. He was baptized in water at 15. He was practical from the beginning. The man God would make a boilermaker, a Bible salesman, and an Amazon canoeist, because that kind of work was what he was made for. Their home country was in decline. Between 1867 and 1886, nearly 500,000 Swedes had left for America. By the turn of the century, it had a name: America. Fever. Gunnar caught it in June 1903. Daniel caught it in March 1902. They did not know each other. They were two young Swedish Baptists going west toward a new country, carrying the faith they had been raised in and a hunger they could not yet name. The Swedish Baptist tradition they came from was not a quiet or ornamental faith. It was forged in the 19th century revival currents that had swept across Scandinavia, influenced by Charles Finney's revivalism as it crossed the Atlantic, shaped by pietism, insistent that conversion was real and that the converted life should look different from the unconverted one. Swedish Baptist communities in both Sweden and America were small, tight, serious. They did not produce passive churchgoers. They produced people who expected God to act and who were shaped, from childhood, to give their lives to something larger than themselves. Gunnar arrived in Kansas City in November 1903, lived with his Uncle Carl, and eventually enrolled at the Swedish Baptist Theological Seminary in Chicago, a 4-year course beginning in the autumn of 1904. He was a student, then a pastor. Trained, educated, leading a Baptist congregation in South Bend, Indiana. He knew the doctrine. He was careful with it. He had the mind of a scholar and the instincts of a preacher. Daniel arrived in Boston in March 1902, traveled to Providence, Rhode Island, and got to work. He was a boilermaker, a founder who worked iron and steel. He specialized. He was good at it. The trade would sustain the mission that was coming, though he did not know that yet. Then, in 1909, everything accelerated. In Chicago, at a Baptist conference at the First Swedish Baptist Church, Gunnar Vingren sought the baptism of the Holy Spirit for 5 days. He did not receive it quickly. He sought it for 5 sustained days of prayer and fasting, setting aside the comfort of having it settled in theology so that he might have it settled in experience. When he received it, he returned to his South Bend church and preached what he had found. His congregation divided. Some accepted it, others did not. He lost the pastorate. The cost of receiving had already begun, and he had not yet heard the word Pará. Daniel Berg received his baptism in the Holy Spirit on a ship. He had returned to Sweden in 1909, homesick, expecting to find his best childhood friend in Vargön. He found instead that Louis Petrus, his closest friend from boyhood, the person who had known him longest, no longer lived there. Petrus had moved to a nearby town and was preaching the gospel, including the baptism of the Holy Spirit. Berg found him. He listened. He studied the scriptures they discussed. He left unsettled in the best possible way. On the return voyage to America, Berg prayed persistently from the moment he said goodbye to his parents on the Swedish dock. He was not concerned about the journey. He had made it before. He gave all his attention to one thing, asking God for what he had heard his friend describe. As the ship neared the North American coast, his prayer was answered. Alone, mid-ocean, no church service, no elder laying hands on him. The Holy Spirit came. Louis Petrus would go on to become the great Pentecostal pioneer of Sweden, leading the Philadelphia Church in Stockholm, shaping a movement that spread across Scandinavia. Berg went south and west. Both men carried the same fire. The destinations simply diverged. On October 12, 1910, at a Baptist conference in Chicago, Daniel Berg met Gunnar Vingren. Both had been baptized in the Holy Spirit. Both felt called to missions but did not yet have a destination. They began meeting daily, praying together, studying the scriptures, waiting. They did not wait long. In South Bend, Indiana, at a prayer meeting in the home of a Spirit-baptized believer named Olaf Ulden, a prophetic word came. The word was Pará. Neither of them recognized it. They did not know what Pará was, whether it was a city, a country, a region, a river. They had been given a destination and they did not know where it was. So they went to the public library. They searched the maps. One of them found it. Pará, a state in the far north of Brazil on the Atlantic coast of the Amazon Delta, equatorial and foreign in every way that mattered. Its capital was Belém do Pará. Equatorial heat, Portuguese, a language neither of them spoke. A continent they had never visited. No contacts, no institutional support, no sponsoring denomination, no salary guarantee. Friends told them they were reckless. Members of their Baptist community said it was not necessary to go to Brazil. You could preach the gospel in Chicago. They had no answer for that argument except the word. The word was enough. What happened next is one of the most remarkable sequences in early Pentecostal missionary history. They had $90 between them. Accounts of this period tell how they gave those $90 to a Pentecostal newspaper in Chicago. The paper needed the money, and they gave it. And how, through a stranger they encountered on the journey to New York, the same sum was returned to them. The exact details vary across Berg's memoirs and later retellings. The provision itself, whatever form it took, was the pattern of the whole mission. Obedience first, confirmation after. They arrived in New York and began searching for a ship. But first, there is something worth sitting with before the story moves forward. These were not wealthy men. They were not the sponsored emissaries of a large missionary society with a committee behind them and a treasurer accounting for their expenses. They were Swedish workers, a metal worker and a pastor, who had given away the only money they had towards something they believed in, received it back through a stranger, and were now in New York looking for a specific ship on a specific date. Whether that date emerged from the prophecy itself or was confirmed through their exhaustive ship search, the result was the same. There was one vessel, on one small line, departing on November 5, 1910, the Clement. They found it only after searching every other option. The date had been confirmed by the difficulty of finding it. Daniel Berg quit his job against his employer's wishes. Gunnar Vingren resigned his pastorate. They sold what they had. On November 5, 1910, they boarded the Clement in New York Harbor. They had their Bibles and their conviction and almost nothing else. 14 days at sea. On November 19, 1910, the Clement docked in Belém, capital of Pará. Berg and Vingren carried their suitcases along what was then 15th of August Avenue to Praça da República, the central square of the city. They sat down on a bench. They prayed. This was their first act on Brazilian soil. Not a sermon, not a strategy meeting, but prayer, on a public bench, in a city that did not know they had arrived. Then they went to their hotel. In the room, someone had left a newspaper. Vingren could not read Portuguese, but he recognized a name in it. An American Methodist pastor he had encountered in North America, whose address appeared in the print. He traced this contact, who connected them to the local Baptist community, which in turn connected them to a Baptist minister named Raimundo Nobre. Nobre gave them the basement of his house to live in. 26-year-old Daniel Berg immediately went looking for work. He found it at the port of Pará, the same trade he had practiced in America, now practiced in equatorial heat for 12,000 reis a day. He also met an English-speaking Presbyterian named Adriano Nobre, who helped them navigate Brazilian life in those early weeks of minimal Portuguese. While Berg worked the furnace, Vingren spent 10 to 12 hours a day studying Portuguese so that he could preach. This is the founding division of the movement. Not the sermon, not the miracle, not the founding of the denomination, but this, one man's body and one man's wage funding another man's language and prayer. Berg's calloused hands from the port of Pará were the financial foundation on which Vingren's preaching would eventually stand. Before Vingren had the language to preach a full sermon in Portuguese, there were weeks of Berg at the foundry and Vingren at the desk, one doing what the other could not. Neither of them could have done what the other did. Berg was practical, entrepreneurial, unafraid of physical labor, a man who would later pack a suitcase with Bibles and travel by canoe into the Amazonian interior, selling them to villages upriver. Vingren was pastoral and theological, a seminary graduate who had given 5 days to seeking the Spirit and would give years to building a doctrine and a denomination that could survive after he was gone. God needed both of them, and he had put them together knowing it. Eventually, as their Portuguese improved, they began holding prayer meetings in the basement. People were healed. Word spread in the Baptist community. Curiosity built. And then, Celina Albuquerque came. Celina Martins Albuquerque was born in Manaus on September 19, 1874. She was married to Henrique Albuquerque, a riverboat captain on the Amazon River. She had given years of faithful service to Sunday school work in the Baptist church. She was now bedridden, an illness that the doctors had named incurable. She heard Berg and Vingren preach about the baptism of the Holy Spirit. She believed what she heard. She began seeking it in prayer. On the night of June 8, 1911, a Thursday, around 1 o'clock in the morning, the miracle that would change the history of Brazil happened. She was healed. She received the Holy Spirit. She spoke in tongues. Word spread through the Baptist community immediately. 2 groups formed, those who accepted the Pentecostal message, those who did not. The division that had been quietly building now had a face and a story, A Brazilian woman healed of an incurable illness at 1 o'clock in the morning, and it was no longer containable. The Baptist pastor drew a line. On June 13, 1911, just 5 days after Selena's night of healing, Berg, Vingren, and 18 other believers were expelled from the Belém Baptist Church. 20 people, 2 Swedes and 18 Brazilians. 5 days later, on June 18, 1911, 19 of those 20 gathered in the home of Selena and Henrique Albuquerque at 67 Siqueira Mendes Street, Belém, Pará, and founded the Apostolic Faith Mission, Missão de Fé Apostólica. They had no organ, no pulpit, no funds, no institutional recognition. They had 19 people, and the conviction that what God had started was not going to stop because a Baptist pastor had said no. Persecution followed immediately. Baptisms were conducted at night by the riverbank because armed men came to prevent them, some carrying knives and machetes. Accounts describe one incident in which an attacker charged directly at Vingren and Selena Albuquerque stepped in front of him. Open-air preachers had chicken heads thrown at them. Priests mocked Vingren publicly. Radicals threatened to burn his house. The word spread anyway. The community that had been expelled from the Baptist Church was not a dying community. It was a community in the process of becoming something that the Baptist Church did not have room for. The healings continued. The tongues continued. Brazilian people heard what was being preached in an accent that was still heavily Swedish and received it in a faith that was entirely their own. The movement was already becoming more Brazilian than its founders. Before we follow Berg and Vingren into the years of building that turned 19, expelled believers into 22 million. A quick word. This story took weeks of research to uncover. Work our members make possible. If you would love to be part of this community that ensures these hidden legacies are told, and told well, hit the Join button on the channel homepage. You will not just be a member of this channel. You will be standing in the same spirit as the witnesses themselves, and encouraging many others to run with endurance the race God has set before them. In the first 4 years, 1911 to 1915, there were 384 water baptisms. In the first decade, the Assembleia de Deus was established in 7 Brazilian states, across the north and northeast, from Pará to Amazonas to Ceará. Berg traveled the Amazon by canoe, then by boat, then by railroad, carrying Bibles into the interior, preaching in villages no mission had reached. Vingren evangelized along the coast and into the northeast. They planted, they moved. They did not consolidate in Belém when Belém was going well. They kept moving. In November 1914, a vision came to Selena Albuquerque. She saw that a man in the village of Tamatatuá in Bragança would convert and would go on to evangelize many villages and rivers. Berg took this vision seriously. He went to Tamatatuá. The man was there. He converted. The vision was accurate. This is the detail that reveals the movement's character. A Brazilian woman's vision directed a Swedish missionary's evangelism. The movement was already not theirs to control. On January 18, 1918, at Vingren's suggestion, the denomination officially adopted the name Assembleia de Deus, Assembly of God. The name came from North America, but the movement it named was already Brazilian in spirit and in leadership trajectory. The movement was also becoming organized. Vingren compiled what would become the Harpa Cristã, the Christian harp, a hymnal that would shape the worship theology of the Assembleia de Deus for over a century. He shaped the theological direction of what was being built. Berg evangelized the interior, ranging farther and farther up the Amazon, into towns and islands and villages that had never had a Bible. The Belém-Bragança Railroad became a route for the gospel. Berg traveling its length, stopping at stations, speaking to whoever would listen. Congregations formed in places that had never had a church. In September 1930, at the first General Convention in Natal, with Louis Petrus, Berg's childhood friend from Vargon, now present as a key mediating figure, Berg and Vingren formally transferred leadership of the Assemblies of God in Brazil to Brazilian pastors. They had not built a Swedish church. They had built a Brazilian one. They had preached in Portuguese. They had adopted Brazilian musical culture. They had raised Brazilian leaders, relied on Brazilian visions, been protected by Brazilian believers. And now they stepped back from the structure they had built, not because they were finished, but because the work required it. A movement that remains the property of its founders never becomes what it was meant to be. This is why the Assembleia de Deus in Brazil grew to approximately 22 million adherents across its conventions. Not despite the handover, but because of it. When Berg and Vingren transferred leadership in 1930, they were completing the mission, not abandoning it. Gunnar Vingren's body had been breaking down for years. Malaria, fever, 2 decades of Amazonian climate, and relentless travel. In 1932, he was diagnosed with stomach cancer. On August 15, 1932, he said goodbye to the Rio de Janeiro church he had been pastoring and returned to Sweden with his family. He died on June 29, 1933, in Gothenburg. He was 53 years old. His wife Frida, sent by the Philadelphia Church in Stockholm, arriving in Belém in July 1917, a woman who had shared Gunnar's calling before she shared his life, was not merely a witness to what was being built. She was a builder. She edited and wrote for O Som da Trombeta, the movement's official newspaper. She composed and translated hymns gathered into the Harpa Cristã, not just compiling what others wrote, but shaping what the church would sing for generations. During Gunnar's frequent severe illnesses, she preached, administered, and held the structure together. They had lost a child, their daughter Margareta, to tropical disease in Brazil. The call cost them more than years and more than health. Frida outlived Gunnar by 7 years. She died in Sweden in 1940. She was 49 years old. She never returned to Brazil. Daniel Berg kept going. He had married Sarah in Sweden in July 1920 and brought her to Brazil in 1921. They had 2 children, David and Deborah. After Vingren died, Berg continued, traveling, planting, preaching, still making the long Amazon journeys at over 70 years old. He settled eventually in the greater São Paulo area. He died on May 27, 1963, age 79, 30 years after Vingren. 3 decades of continued work without his founding partner. Berg's memoirs were published in Portuguese as Enviado por Deus, sent by God. Vingren's diary was also published. Both are considered historical treasures in Brazilian Pentecostalism. The men who had no plan when they sat on a bench in Praça da República left behind enough of their interior lives to let the people they served know what it had cost. The 4 disciplines. The first discipline, obedience to one word before understanding arrives. They heard Pará and went to a library. They did not call a committee. They did not wait for institutional permission. They did not require a budget before they acted. They looked up the word on a map, confirmed it was where God was sending them, and went. The obedience preceded every comfort. Language, contacts, salary, safety. They obeyed before they understood, because the kind of obedience that requires understanding first is not obedience. It is agreement. This is the discipline that launches movements, not brilliant strategy, not impressive credentials. The willingness to hear one word from God and act on it before you can explain it to anyone else. The second discipline, sacrificial labor as an act of worship. Berg's foundry work in Belém was not separate from the mission. It was the mission's foundation. The boilermaker who stoked iron in equatorial heat for 12,000 rays a day was as central to what God was building as the pastor studying Portuguese in the basement. His wages funded the work. His body paid the physical cost. His trade was not a detour from the calling. It was the channel through which the calling was sustained. Berg never confused the furnace with failure. He had come to give his life for the salvation of souls, and giving his life meant giving his labor first. The man who was stoking boilers at the port of Pará was the same man who later traveled by canoe through the Amazon, selling Bibles to villages that had never had them. Unglamorous, practical, unglossy work, done faithfully, and nothing built on top of it could have been built without it. The third discipline, releasing what you built to those it was built for. In 1930, 20 years after arriving on a bench in Praça da República, Berg and Vingren stood aside and handed leadership to Brazilian pastors. This was not inevitable. Many missionary enterprises of that era held tightly to the structures they had built, remaining foreign in accent and in control decades after planting. This one did not. The discipline of releasing is the one that separates a movement from a colony. A colony remains the property of the people who planted it. A movement becomes the property of the people who inhabit it. Berg and Vingren understood early as the moment Selina Albuquerque's vision directed their evangelism, that the Spirit was working through Brazilian believers with the same authority it worked through Swedish missionaries. The Handover in 1930 was the institutional acknowledgement of what had been spiritually true for years, and it is why approximately 22 million people now call the Assembleia de Deus their church. The fourth discipline, the long obedience that continues after the fire, costs you everything. Vingren died at 53. His wife died at 49. They had buried a child in Brazilian soil before they buried each other. The fire consumed both of them. Berg kept going. 30 more years, still making the journeys, still preaching, still planting in a country that had cost him his founding partner and his youth. The discipline is not the dramatic departure on the Clement in November 1910. The discipline is what Berg did from June 1933, when Vingren died, until May 1963, when Berg himself did. 30 years of going. 30 years of continuing the work after the visible partner was gone, after the founding story had become history, after the movement had grown far beyond what two men on a park bench could have imagined. The call does not end when the founding partner does. It ends when God says it does. The bench in Praça da República now carries a memorial plaque. 2 Swedish workers, a word from God, a foundry wage, almost nothing, planted a movement of 22 million. Vingren died at 53 without seeing the number. Berg kept going 30 more years alone. The word that sent them was not one they chose. It chose them. What word has God spoken over you that you have not yet obeyed? Comment below with, Lord. One word from you is enough. If you are ready to move before the plan arrives. Don't forget to hit that notification bell. Like and subscribe to Cloud of Witnesses for more life-changing stories of faith that will equip you to boldly fulfill the call of God in your life. This week, write down the last word God spoke to you that you have not acted on. Pray over it 15 minutes for 3 consecutive mornings. Then take one step before the week ends. The next witness stayed on the American side of the ocean. Same fire, different soil. Garfield Thomas Haywood wrote hymns that carried the Pentecostal movement's deepest convictions about God. He built, he led. And then he was asked to pay a price only a man of genuine conviction could pay. His name is Garfield Thomas Haywood. Check out this next video to discover how a black bishop shaped Pentecostal theology, what it costs to hold conviction when a movement turns, and what God can do through a man who will not bend.